When it comes to video game franchises, one of the ones that I will love forever, no matter what ends up happening, is Resident Evil. When I first laid eyes on the original game back in the mid-90s, I begged my parents for a PS1, going over friends' houses to play through the games until I actually had a PlayStation of my own. I was on message boards almost on a nightly basis or replaying through the games, looking through every nook and cranny of the rooms, memorizing the bios of the characters, and researching the creatures themselves, figuring out what exactly made them. I was absolutely obsessed with Resident Evil, getting various action figures, reading the Resident Evil novels, and of course getting the Resident Evil archives once it was released. While the series may be on a downward slope for many longtime Resident Evil fans, I will always play games that have a Resident Evil name attached to them. So without further ado though, let's go over my 5 favorite games in the Resident Evil franchise. While I still consider myself not much of an online gamer and much more into the single-player experiences, I still have to admit that Resident Evil Outbreak made me an online player for quite a while. Both File 1 and File 2, while separate games, I'm putting here as one entry on this list. Both games featured 5 scenarios for you to play through, and is the reason I went out and got a PS2 hard drive and a PS2 modem adapter so that I could actually play these games online. Every night, every day, I was on these servers building up my points, trying out the various scenarios on the various difficulties, trying to master the very hard modes and nightmare difficulties of File 2, as well as also unlocking all the costumes and extras that were possible to get. I played through so many times that I was able to fully get through them at the blink of an eye. Me and my group would be able to start a scenario, each one of us knew exactly what we needed and wanted to do, and go right through and blast through these scenarios one after another, and it never got old to me. Getting to revisit some of the areas of Raccoon City, such as the police department or the Umbrella facility in Resident Evil 2. New ones that were added into the mix, like the hotel or the hospital that was covered in overgrown trees, being chased around by the Axeman, or having to fight an evil zombie elephant and zombie lion in a zoo. While maybe over the top and a bit different than what you may be expecting, every one of the scenarios throughout Resident Evil Outbreak was a bit different from one another, each having their own objectives that you had to complete in order to get the best overall rankings and points for each of them. Resident Evil Outbreak was far from a perfect experience. There was no way to communicate using headsets, and yes, this was still early online, but PS2 headsets were a regular thing, even being bundled with certain games. Using the ad-lib system just wasn't as enjoyable, and while I got good enough and with a good group that we were able to go through without ever having to talk to one another, in fact, we also would jump on a messenger so that we were actually able to communicate in brief little messages back and forth during the course of the scenario so that we knew what each of the members was doing and trying to complete the various goals. But overall, while Outbreak, may not be perfect, and yes, had a lot of issues, especially loading unless you had that hard drive, it will still be forever fondly remembered in my heart as one of the first games that got me into online play, and one of my favorite games in the series. When it comes to my favorite characters in Resident Evil, Barry Burton and Claire Redfield will always be 1 and 2, and any game that features them as playable will definitely get more points in my book, even if the gameplay is overall terrible. Resident Evil Cove Veronica, though, was one of those ones that put Claire in the starring role again, and while yes, you get to play as Chris as well throughout the course of the gameplay, in fact, Chris gets to actually end the game, the fact that Claire got another starring role was always a bright spot for the game for me. I didn't have a Dreamcast originally when Cove Veronica was released and actually had to go over friends' houses to play it, though I did of course get a Dreamcast later on and get the game. But it wasn't until Cove Veronica X, released for PS2 and has been since re-released on many systems, that I truly got to experience Cove Veronica and got to enjoy the knife gameplay that I still love and think is one of the most fun and enjoyable knifing experiences of all the RE franchise. The story may not be the best, and it adds one of the worst characters ever in Steve Burnside to the game, but even with the annoying bits of Steve, The love for Claire that I have outweighed it, and I still enjoyed playing through it, especially being able to knife down zombies, Cerberuses, and Bandersnatches along the way in order to finally complete the game. Any Resident Evil expert has probably at least attempted to do a knife-only run, and Cove Veronica is the only game that I was ever able to successfully complete by using the knife-only, so for that alone, I will always love Resident Evil Cove Veronica and never forget that night when I finally actually completed the game without using any of the other weapons available in my arsenal. The bright moments of not only having to deal with Wesker, but Alexia as a character. Alfred Ashford may not be the most fondly remembered, but for me, I always laugh anytime I end up hearing his voice or any of the cutscenes end up playing that he's involved with. Alexia was a really cool main villain, and getting to travel to the Antarctic base as well as the island was definitely a nice change of pace, adding some new BOW weapons into the game as well as bringing back some favorites like the Hunters. Cove Veronica may not be the best of the classic Resident Evil style games, but it's definitely one of my personal favorites. Resident Evil 4. Just mentioning the name brings out emotions in Resident Evil fans. It may be good, it may be bad, but either way, Resident Evil 4 changed the series as well as changed gaming as a whole. A game that was marred with delays and changes, with multiple different prototype versions of it being created before we got that final product. But as soon as I played the game and no longer was at the tank controls or fixed camera angles, which don't get me wrong, I love and adore and never had an issue with, but it changed how I looked and approached into action games. When the camera snapped forward on the Leon's shoulder and I blasted off the first villager's head, I was just like, wow, like, it amazed me at just that moment and I was hooked. It was so different, and I will never say that Resident Evil 4 is my favorite in the series, but it's still so fun to play. Yes, the set pieces are kind of overblown and the story is all over the place and sometimes feels disjointed from one another, but it has amazing boss encounters. I love fighting El Gigante or the village chief, Sadler, or Salazar, or fighting Salazar's right-hand man. Each one of them could be defeated in a couple of ways usually, even using the minimal amount of ammo that you have or getting that one-use rocket launcher from the salesman and blasting it away. Even though it would cost you a good amount of gold, it was well worth it to easily bypass some of the tougher bosses and challenges that the game ended up laying forward. And I don't think anyone who's ever played the game can ever forget the first time they encountered Dr. Salvador, the chainsaw-wielding, burlap sack-wearing maniac who busted through the villagers and in just a second could knock your head clean off. It was the first time since Resident Evil 1 when the hunters were able to decapitate you when you first got back from the guardhouse. But in this game, this was like the beginning. The second screen area that you got to go to was the village, and here's a one-hit kill enemy first introduced to you when you have almost no ammo at your disposal. Yes, it may not be as horror-based and much more action-y, quick-time events, and more Hollywood movie-esque, but Resident Evil 4 is still a blast to play to this day. I can't wait to replay it on PS4, and I've played it on almost every system that it's currently been re-released for. I played it on GameCube, PS2, PS3, Xbox 360, and once again I'll be playing it on PS4. But right now I could even boot the game up on any of the systems and still have fun. Even the Wii version with motion controls was at least an interesting experiment at the least. While you may not love Resident Evil 4 if you're an old school Resident Evil fan and maybe don't like the way it changed RE, but I don't think you can deny that Resident Evil 4 had a huge impact and was still a very well made game. During the 6th generation of consoles, one of the reasons I was glad I had a GameCube was Resident Evil 1 Remake. This game blew me away the first time I booted it up. If you were a longtime fan that played the original Resident Evil, seeing it make that leap in just graphical styling, it was so much darker and much more horrific looking. Every corridor that had been in the original was redone that looked amazing, and they added all new elements to the mansion to make it even vastly superior in every way from the original Resident Evil. They added in some new villains and new mechanics that may not have been loved by everyone, but I personally enjoy, like the self-defense weapons, or of course the vicious, Crimson Heads. The added story elements of adding in Lisa and just her entire family's backstory was a pretty gripping one. That entire encounter at the end, even though when she screams out "Mommy" may not have been the scariest thing I've ever heard, it still made me feel for the character as a whole, and I didn't want to kill her. Not that I could have, because she's invulnerable. It also made me question whether or not I should actually kill my favorite character in Barry just so I could get a hold of his weapon, which is still my favorite gun in the entire RE franchise. And besides Lisa, all the updated boss encounters were awesome to re-fight in RE1 Remake, like Yawn the Giant Snake or the Giant Shark Neptune, Plant 42, and of course the Tyrant. Even the enemies in the game, the normal monsters, were scarier than ever. Not just zombies, but the Cerberus, the Chimera, the Staples Hunter, and of course, how can I forget, the spiders. Even to this day, the giant, hairy tarantula of spiders will still make my skin crawl. When you go into the guardhouse and enter into the rec room, and that giant spider crawls down the wall behind you, even though I've played the game 1,000 times probably at this point, that moment still is one of the few that can get my skin to crawl in any Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 1 Remake's been re-released a few times now on newer systems, so it's never been a better time to try out Resident Evil, and it's one of the games, if you're ever going to play anything with the Resident Evil name, try to get into the series via the RE1 Remake, as it's not only that old school feel, but was redone and done so well, and in fact there's newer control schemes on the newer versions for those more accustomed to newer Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 1 Remake took everything I loved about RE and just made it better. Before we get to number 1 though, a couple of honorable mentions. Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2, but especially 1, I felt went back to a bit more of the RE roots with some more backtracking, horror elements, and puzzle solving. It was still a more modern Resident Evil with the control scheme, but getting to play another new game with Jill and Chris in the canon story for RE was still very fun to do and has some cool boss fights overall throughout the course of the game. It was updated and re-released on the PlayStation 3, Wii U, and Xbox 360, so that version is the one I would recommend even more so than the 3DS, unless you have the dual-stick control on the 3DS or have a new Nintendo 3DS. But either way, Revelations 1, I do still highly recommend checking it out if for some reason you haven't yet. As for Revelations 2, well, not nearly as good, and I didn't like the fact that it was done episodically overall. The fact that I got to play as Claire and Barry again will always put it up a little bit higher on my list. And small spoilers, the ending of the scenario using Barry, he has some amazing moments that makes that game worth playing, especially if you are a Barry Burton fan like I am. The original Resident Evil that started it all, of course, I have to give at least a little nod to it. It was re-released and so many different versions were created. I still to this day have my PC original release for RE1, the Sega Saturn version, and of course 4 different versions on the PlayStation 1 alone. And while I do love all those versions, I do recommend, if you can get a hold of it, the Deadly Silence version for the Nintendo DS. It did add an arranged mode to add some touchscreen minigames, but the core original version of the game is included and adds the amazing ability to skip the door sequences. Sure, PC versions of Resident Evil have been hacked to remove those sequences altogether, but just being able to skip them on an actual full release version as it was intended is one of the coolest aspects of Resident Evil Deadly Silence. So if you can get a copy of it and you're a fan of Resident Evil and never tried it, I definitely recommend giving it a look. While Resident Evil 1 started it all, Resident Evil 2 is the game that cemented it as one of my absolute favorite game franchises. Yes, we were introduced to Leon, and of course my favorite character, Claire, through 2 stories that, while very similar to one another, if played back to back with Claire A and Leon B, or Leon A and Claire B, there were some differences, meeting different characters, different areas, and sometimes there was even items that could be found in one, and if you got them, you couldn't get them in the other scenario. It introduced new enemies to the mix. Yeah, the ivies, the walking plants, really not all that interesting to me at least, but the lickers became iconic. The exposed brain and long tongues, when it crawls across the window in one hallway and then you jump into the next hallway and it falls down on you, pretty scary moment, and one of those few iconic ones that RE2 fans will always remember. Just the location of the police station. Not a conventional police station by any means. It's such a weird and unique design, but I love it. It's still one of my absolute favorite places in any video game ever. It's one of those ones I would love to see an actual person get the money to rebuild the police station and actually be able to open it up to Resident Evil fans to go and explore. I love it even more than the original Spencer Mansion, which is hard because I absolutely love both of the locations and have every room just about memorized in my head. Even now I could probably draw a halfway decent blueprint of the police station, each room, and what they ended up containing. RE2 is absolutely my favorite game Resident Evil ever brought to the table, and I think that even with the changes and the way that Resident Evil has evolved, I will always have RE2. I play it at least once a year, and no, I'm not nearly as good at it now as I was back in the day, as I like to just relive that moment and that nostalgia on a once a year basis so that I don't oversaturate myself with it and still get to relive all those great moments and remember back to the time when I first got a chance to actually play it. I loved it on PS1 and loved playing it again on the N64 and have played it on every system that it has since been re-released. It also had one of my favorite villains in the franchise. William Birkin as a character, honestly just okay. I much prefer Wesker, don't get me wrong, but it was the transformations that made Birkin cool. While he may not be the biggest and baddest of all these weird Resident Evil villains that the series has now had with the later entries, but the transformations were all different from one another, especially when you went from the more staining tyrant form to the dog-like form to the final giant blob-esque thing on the end of the train. Overall, while the character may not have been as memorable, those encounters I will never forget. Holding the controller tight in my hand, just waiting and sweating as the cutscenes were playing out until I finally had a chance to actually fight them, and then quickly trying to run away or dodge and get the right shots off at those right moments. RE2 has some of the most nostalgia for me than any of the other games in the franchise, and I'm not saying it's a perfect game, but RE2 will forever be my favorite game in the Resident Evil world. So there you have it, my favorite games in the Resident Evil franchise. What's your favorite game in the series, or maybe even your favorite boss or character? Is there any other Resident Evil countdowns you would like to see me do in the future? Coming up next, though, I will be definitely doing a top 5 worst Resident Evil games, so be sure to be on the lookout for that. But anyway, guys, that will wrap up this countdown. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoy.